Something in the way she moves. Beatles for you on WBLQ. All right. The time now is 9:04, WBLQ Music Time, here on Friday night, the Frigid Friday. And what I have for you next is an interview I did with Dale Parsons. There's an intro that's on here. I didn't take the time to take the intro out because, frankly, I spent all afternoon editing. But it says after midnight. It's not. Of course, it's 9:04 WBLQ time. Enjoy this. And a little bit later on, we'll try to get in the Frank Zappola interview. Enjoy. All right, just past midnight here on WBLQ, Stereo 1230 and 103.1 FM, also on hitoldies.net. Appreciate you all listening all weekend long to the WNBC Time Machine Weekend. What I have for you now is an interview that I did with Dale Parsons for our Memorial Day 2022 edition of the Time Machine. There's some very good information in here. Dale and I cracked up, had a lot of fun, and he tells some pretty good stories, so kick back and relax. Let's hear an interview that I did with Dale Parsons right here on Stereo 1230 and 103.1 FM WBLQ. Dale, when did you start in radio? Guess that's the first question.
Gosh, it was when I was in high school, probably around 1966 or so. Now, I used to hang out at radio stations from like about 1960 on. When I guess the first radio station I ever would hang around, they had a remote trailer. It was WGH in Norfolk. And they were always at the car dealership that my father was a parts manager at, Casey Chevrolet. And I'd go to work with him, and then I'd go out and stand and watch the guy in the trailer do his show, and eventually they'd let me in. And if you want a great book, it's called Loving Life. You can get it on Amazon. It's by a guy named Gene Loving, who was a disc jockey at WGH for years. In fact, he owns a bunch of stations now. In fact, one of them is WGH. He owns a bunch of TV stations too. But he put out this book of his career. He was with the Beatles. He traveled with the Beatles and all kinds of stuff in this thing. But he's got this one passage in there where he talks about when I used to hang outside the trailer and watch him.
Wow. So you got started in around 1960. Well, you said, I think I got started the same way, hanging out at radio stations. Yeah. I was a DX listener at first, being on the East Coast. Think of all the blowtorch signals that propagated over our way. I was getting WLS at night. I was a big fan of WKBW. I mean, a giant fan of KB. I loved them. And we had WPTR Albany that came in, 1540 WPTR. Sometimes the signal would be so strong it'd wipe out KB. 2 KC down. Of course, WABC, but of course, by 1980, they were done anyway. They may have changed in 1982, but when they moved to that more middle-of-the-road approach, all the excitement was gone. They had already killed it. It was funny because NBC took over, in my opinion, as the New York station. Because just about the time ABC went out of business and went to talk, you guys had brought in Howard Stern, and bam! I mean, you were there at one point, like in 1983, before Z100 launched. You guys were the hottest top 40 station in the city.
Yeah, it did really well. And it was like it took years for NBC to finally click with something because they had been all over the place. They had tried all kinds of different things. In the 60s, they were talk for a while, and they were walk, this and that. In the 60s, that's when I was listening to WABC, and down in the Norfolk area, back then when there weren't as many AM stations around, sometimes at night I could pick up WMCA. Now, there are places outside of New York, right outside of the city, where you couldn't pick up WMCA, but I would on a skip down there in Norfolk, and I would listen to stations like that. Occasionally, you'd pick up KQV in Pittsburgh, of course WLS, later on WCFL. There was a guy that was at WGH who went to WCFL about 1969, Larry O'Brien, and he was there for a few years, and then he and John Gary, who had been a program director at WGH in the 60s, wound up in Pittsburgh and did mornings at a couple of stations there and were huge in Pittsburgh until they retired a few years back. But, the station I started at was a country music station, WTID, and it was a daytimer. Mm-hmm. And about, probably 4 or 5 years earlier, they had a guy working there by the name of Robert Smith, and that's when the call letters were WYOU. And Robert used to listen to WGH, and WGH had this guy named Bob Calvert, who was just a real talent. And he would be on the air on weekends with an alter ego called Baron Bebop. And Baron Bebop would be, it's the old Baron Bebop, baby. And Robert Smith loved listening to this guy. And so he developed a character from that. He considers Bob to be his inspiration for Wolfman Jack.
Yeah.
And that was his first radio job there in Newport News, Virginia.
Starting right off in a medium market station. And some personalities were just so good they really started in the middle or even at the top, which is amazing. When I was in Memphis, the legacy of WHBQ goes back to the mid-'50s with Dewey Phillips. Who, and all his antics. Dewey, he was so wild that eventually they had to let him go. And he essentially drank himself to death, which, it was too bad because he was radio's best kept secret at that point. But radio had changed a lot, too. By the time the 1960s came along, his shtick was already passé.
Yeah. The 50s was an interesting time. I've talked to people that came out of the 40s and they were trying to figure out something to do in the 50s because television had come in and television was just killing radio because the big network, it used to be, if you weren't one of the big network stations, if you didn't carry one of the big networks, you were considered garbage. If you played music and news, that was junk. About the only successful stations that did that were stations like WNEW. They weren't with a big network, so they had to figure out something to do. But most of the other smaller stations were considered inferior if they didn't have a big radio network. And when the 50s rolled around, those big radio networks kind of died. And so they had no idea what to do. And what really filled the void was the music and news. And then when rock and roll came along in top 40, that's what really saved AM radio, radio in period, because there wasn't much of FM anyway. I know people that had FM frequencies back then that sold them because they figured they'd never be able to do anything with them. And they lived to regret that.
Oh, yeah. Well, it took a long time for FM to catch on, but once it did, it took the manufacturers to put FM in cars. You remember when they had those little FM converters, and you would put the box in, and you would tune to like 1400, and then you could tune your FM receiver. That's something that young people today don't even know existed.
I didn't like FM. I didn't like the sound of FM. I preferred the sound of AM because that's what I'd grown up with. The FM was it was too clear. There was something about it that just wasn't right.
There was something missing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was, it was that way with me for a long time. I think the first FM station that really captured me, I was in New York, and this was in the early 80s, and I was in some shop, and they were playing over the speakers there, CBS FM. And I thought, wow, that just sounds so cool. Those oldies sound so good on the FM, and their processing was just right. And of course, they had all of the old WABC performers in there too. They were starting to come over. I remember, I think that night I heard Jack Spector, who was at MCA.
That's right. Yes.
And I thought, well, this is so cool. And it sounded great for years, but the other problem that FM had with playing oldies was that most of those, in fact, all of those oldies were for AM radio.
Yeah, it was the way they processed them. Sure, yes.
It just didn't sound right on FM. And when CDs came along, the early CDs sounded like junk because they sounded very tinny. And it took a while for me to want to do anything with a CD of oldies on the radio. Newer selections were pretty good, but they just couldn't get those masters right on some of those CDs, Ronco CDs and things like that.
Right.
It just sounded really.
Well, I know. I've always thought that vinyl had a more warm sound to it.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I love it. I used to. One of the things we used to do at NBC, we did this on the time machine, because the sound of the whole thing was. We would try our best to dub from vinyl. Now, a lot of stuff we had over the years, we'd gotten 15 IPS tape, and that's where a lot of our music came from right off the master. But for the vinyl, we would record it at 30 IPS, and then if there were any pops and clicks, we'd edit them out with a razor blade, and make sure that, you just didn't have Q-burn or pops or scratches or anything like that on the air. And then everything was recorded onto tape cartridge through Dolby. And so the noise and the hiss just went away. So it was a pretty neat little system. And people would say, why did you do that for AM? Well, the better the quality of the product, the better it's going to sound on the air.
Of course.
So you got to do everything you can to make it sound good. And so we went that extra mile.
It surely showed, man. I mean, it just, you guys rocked, and it was loud, and it was clean. And that was that was one of the big takeaways. And, you add that to the reverb, the overall processing of the station. I'm sure that you could probably name off a number of good engineers that worked at WNBC while you were there.
Well, the two transmitter engineers, the ones that were responsible for that sound, Michael Buck and Gary Blau. And I think Gary replaced Michael, but Michael had put the initial system in. And I think Michael was also in charge of the renovation of the studios, because the studios they were not really up to par for a long time. I know when Wolfman was there, originally in 1974, I think it was, the sound of the station was horrible. It sounded like somebody had, stuffed a sock over your speaker. They just had the worst audio whatsoever, and it took a long time to get all of that fixed. But I know Michael did a great job putting it together, and Gary continued it on. But we had all kinds of great engineers in the station. We had Gene Garnes, who was just a wonderful engineer. Bruce Leonard, people like Gary All, just people that really knew how to make the product sound sparkling.
And you were blessed to have them. So when did you take over as WNBC's program director? That's the question. I've tried to think back, and I don't remember when. Kevin
Matheny left in, I think, February of '84, and he went to MTV. He was putting together VH1 over there. And
so he worked with Les Garland.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And he was, they had nobody in there as program director for almost a year. The general manager was Randy Bongard. And Randy was, in the middle of all of that, was up to president of the radio division. So he didn't hire his replacement until, I think it was the end of September 1984. And that was John Hayes, who came in from San Francisco. And John immediately started looking for a program director. I think Lyndon Abel, who was the assistant program director, was sort of, acting PD at the time. And John put an ad in Radio and Records, and I saw it, and I sent a letter. And about a week later, he gave me a call. Said, we talked for a while. He said, well, how would you like to come up and visit or something? So I went up for the first of 4 or 5 interviews. I think I interviewed everybody, from Grant Tinker down to painting the cleaning.
J.D. LeCue, the cleaning. Well, take a page out of Howard Stern.
One of my favorite people in the world. We've been missing each other on the phone here the last few months, and we're going to catch up with each other eventually.
Good.
But she's one of my favorite people. I remember I got a call one day from AFTRA that you have somebody on the air that is not with the union. I said, well, who's that? They said, someone named Janie. Well, Janie used to go into Howard's studio and start cleaning, and he started talking to her. And that was okay, every now and then. But it became a regular thing, so AFTRA wanted her to join the union. So we paid her initiation dues, and she became an AFTRA member, and every week I'd have to, Howard's producer would tell me how much she talked in there, how long, whatever, and I'd send it off to accounting, and she'd get some big check every week for delivering coffee to Howard.
This is the best gig in radio. Oh, my. Hey, listen, you were there for, 84, so you were there for a good 4 years. What was your favorite moment, do you think?
There were a lot of things that we did that were fun. The Time Machine was probably one of the most fun things that we did on the air. And it was brought about by, we had not renewed Joey Reynolds' contract. He was doing afternoons.
Right.
And so we were going to move Alan Combs, who was doing overnights, into his show, into afternoons. But Jay Sorensen, who was sort of Joey's sidekick, not only a sidekick, but by that point we'd gone to combo, which meant people on the air had to run their own board.
Right.
So we hired Jay as a sidekick for the show, and he was talent that ran the board for the show. But his contract still had another year left on it. So we were trying to figure out where to put him, and we thought, we'll put him in overnights. We'd been doing, before Alan Combs, we'd done Wolfman with the Graffiti Gold. We thought, we'll put Jay on overnight and have him play oldies. And John and I were talking, and John said, well, why don't we, can you do something more than just playing the oldies? And I said, well, let's do a retro thing. And he said, yeah, we can call it like the Time Tunnel or the Time Machine or something. I said, yeah, that sounds great. And I said, we've got this old plate reverb unit in storage. Why don't we put that on the air? I can get some of the classic jingles. NBC already had a bunch of them that John Neff had ordered back in the 70s. That top of the hour ID, not the ID, but it's from Series 18 Jams. It's called the Contempo cut. He had that cut for WNBC in the mid-70s.
Right, and that was a standard at WABC, as a matter of fact. Same element.
Yeah. So I said, well, we can run those. We'll get some of the other ones recut. And it wasn't the easiest thing in the world to have new Pam's jingles cut, because at that point they had gone through bankruptcy. And no one really knew who owned what. And there were a number of different factions that were all fighting for the masters. And some had the actual masters, some had copies of the masters, the master tapes and everything. And so I used a company called CPMG and had them recut a number of cuts. And, it was fun. They did a nice job. But there were some things that didn't sound quite beefy enough, a little too thin. So Jim Collins, who's, God bless him, he's since passed, he and I went into the studio at night and sort of remixed things. We would remix it with the masters of the WGH Pams and WABC Pams jingles that I had. And then if the vocals didn't sound quite beefy enough, I'd add myself singing under it, singing a bass line under it.
He said you guys had to use your musical talents at this point.
Oh, yeah. And
oh, wow.
We needed a Sonovox, so Dan Taylor had his own Sonovox, so he cut all the Sonovox cuts.
Yeah, and those are amazing. I listen to them; they're clear, and I wondered how you got everything to sound perfect. WNBC with the chimes, it was just amazing.
Yeah, that was, now that's done with, the way that whole thing works is you have a control track that you run through the system when you're mouthing in the Sonovox the NBC,
mm-hmm.
and it comes out,
right.
But it's based on whatever the tune is on that control track.
I think isn't the idea behind it pretty much the same idea behind a fuzz box for a guitar?
Very similar.
Yeah,
very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sonovox was developed years ago. Well, Disney used it in movies and in some of their cartoons,
mm-hmm.
But it was also used for people whose voice box.
Oh, that's right.
So all they put this thing up to their neck, like two cups they put up to their neck, and they'd mouth the words, and it would come out like whatever.
Yes, that's right. I didn't realize the connection there. Well, that's wonderful. So yeah, the Time Machine, and certainly one of my favorite memories of WNBC, but I think the entire era of the mid and late 80s, certainly my favorite station, probably on AM of all time, no doubt.
Some people say, one of my favorite shows was Soupy Sales Show. And there are people who are pure radio purists, and they say, well, it didn't fit this, blah, blah, blah. Well, he was really one of the hardest working people I've ever come across. He worked until, late putting together the comedy for the show, and Ray D'Ariano was his sidekick, and he and Ray worked together wonderfully. And, Soupy was an interesting character. You had Soupy and you had Imus before him. Now, there was one point there where Soupy and Imus had big problems because Imus had a tendency to leave the studio a little bit of a mess.
Oh boy.
I kept telling you got to clean up the studio, and Soupy kept complaining to me. Following Imus is like following a garbage truck in July. So one day, Soupy came in and said, there's cereal everywhere. You got to tell him no more. So I went into Imus. I said, look, before you leave, have your producer clean up everything. No more cereal lying around. Why, he doesn't like cereal? No, he just doesn't like your cereal all over the console. Okay, well, we'll fix it. Next day, just before he left the studio, he opened up 2 boxes of cereal and threw them all over the studio, and they were everywhere.
Oh, my God, that was Imus.
Soupy was not pleased at all.
I'm sure he wasn't. Wow. Well, all that is dead and gone, and it's radio history, and God bless you guys. You put on the best show you possibly could. What are you doing in radio today?
Right now, I do some voiceovers. Don't really do a whole lot of radio per se.
Yeah.
For a few years, I was consulting some stations and did that for a while. But now, my wife and I have a bed and breakfast here in Hana on Maui and out here in the jungle, and we basically take care of that, and it's good. We have I think we have 9 cats and a couple of chickens. And
there you go.
There's all kinds of stuff growing in the yard. We got tomatoes and all kinds of things. So life is good.
Then keep it up. My wife's going to want to go out and visit. That's exactly what she likes.
Come on out.
Never been to Hawaii. Never.
Well, I had never been to Hawaii until 1987. Now, Jenny and I had been dating for a while back then. We met sort of indirectly through NBC. She and a friend of hers, girlfriend of hers, were trying to put together a 2-person female show. And so they were trying to reach me to give me the tape. And back then I was horrible at answering, messages. I didn't return messages. It was just, I was a jerk. So, but there was so much going on, I didn't have time to do anything. By the time I thought about getting to the telephone, it was 8 o'clock at night. So they were, Jenny had been at it was like a bar or something, and there was a guy playing the piano there at the bar, a guy named Akashan, and he was a piano-playing psychic. And he saw Jenny, and he said, I know you're in marketing. And she said, I was wondering, said, Regis Philbin came in last night and said he wanted me on his show, and that's when they were still doing the local show. And he said, have my manager give him a call. He said, I don't have a manager. He said, can you pretend like you're my manager and call and set me up? I said, sure. So she did and got him on the show, and she went with him that day. And after the show was over, she was talking to Regis, and she said, I've got, my girlfriend and I have a tape that we're trying to get into NBC, to WNBC. Do you have any contacts with Dale Parsons? Forget about Dale Parsons. He doesn't answer anybody's phone call. Great. He said, but you need to talk to Rodney, his producer, Soupy sales producer. So she called Rodney, Soupy's producer, and she the pretense was to get Akashan on Soupy's show. And Rodney said, well, we don't have any openings right now, but maybe you could talk to Bill Grunfest. Bill and his wife do a show on weekends. They have an interview show. And so it's sort of a comedy show. So she called Billy Grunfest, talked to his producer, and they said, yeah, we'll get you on the show. Come on down. So it'll be on the Saturday. And so in fact, Billy Grunfest later on went on to be one of the executive producers of Mad About You TV show. But she came down, she brought Akashan in, and it was a Saturday, and I was at home, and I thought, maybe I need to go into the station today and get some work done. So I went into the station about the same time, and I'm back in the music room, music library, and I'm working on the computer. And this woman comes in and comes to the door, and she says, I'm looking for Dale Parsons' office. I said, it's right over there. She said, do you know Dale Parsons? I said, yeah, that's me. She said, oh. And so she stuck out her hand. She said, I'm Jenny Sullivan. I said, oh, nice. And I guess 5 months later, we were married.
Oh, nice.
But we were going to go to Hawaii. We were going to go to Maui for our vacation around Thanksgiving of '87. And I'd never been really on a vacation before, and so I was telling Imus about it. And he said, well, you want to get married while you're out. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, where are you going to? He said, in fact, I'm going to announce it on the air tomorrow. I said, you were getting married when you got to Mount. So I went home and I told Jenny, I said, I think we better get married when we got to Maui. She said, how come? I said, well, Agnes is going to announce it tomorrow. She said, okay.
That was... Well, you know what? Sometimes marriages last longer when it's a spur-of-the-moment question than one that's thought about, you know?
Yeah, so that was 33 years ago.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations on you guys and your happiness.
Yes, life is good. This is a very good place.
And that's the end. That's all we have recorded of it. An interview I did with Dale Parsons back for the Memorial Day WNBC Time Machine Weekend that you heard right here on WBLQ. Thanks for listening to the Time Machine all weekend long. We return you now to the WBLQ Time Machine overnight, and we'll pick it up in just a couple of minutes.